Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here, and thank you so much for being on time. Since I did promise we would start promptly at 9, I am very, very grateful to have seen how many of you were here at 8:30 even this morning. The tables, I hope you're finding a place to sit. It looks like everyone's good. What's most important is, if you're not finding a place, is that you have a buddy basically in your area that you can discuss during our breakout sessions. We're going to have a fairly active learning session this morning. There'll be 4 different breakout times in our 3 hours together. So just want to make sure you have someone to talk with. There also will be 4 brief announcements afterwards, so please stay seated. Also, if at any time you feel the need for caffeine and/or fruit, just go ahead and get up. That's fine. We will have an official break in a little bit. So let me introduce our speaker this morning. We are so fortunate to have Seattle University Professor Emeritus of English, John Bean, with us today. John's reputation far exceeds the boundaries of SU's First Hill. He is regularly invited to conduct faculty workshops around the world, and in fact, he is squeezing his time with us today with having just come back from Zambia in helping to establish a writing center at a Jesuit college there, and I believe you are jetting off tomorrow to Florida to the Conference on College Composition and Communication, where he'll be part of a panel discussing his research with transferring writing skills from SU's first-year seminar to work in the majors. And delighted to have you with us to discuss similar issues today. John has taught at SU since 1986. He received his undergraduate degree from Stanford in 1965 and his doctorate from the University of Washington in 1972. In between his undergraduate and graduate work, he served in Vietnam as an Army lieutenant. He focused his initial scholarship on Renaissance literature, publishing articles on Shakespeare and Spenser, but by the early 1980s, his scholarly focus morphed to rhetoric and composition, with a special interest in writing across the curriculum and all forms of pedagogical theory and practice connected to active learning, critical thinking, and the teaching of undergraduate research. In 2008, he was the principal investigator of a $300,000 Teagle Foundation grant titled Using Embedded Assignments to Create Communities of Assessment in the Majors and the Core Curriculum of Seattle University and Gonzaga University. His current research continues to focus on writing in the majors, leading to undergraduate research projects and disciplinary capstone papers during senior year. SU has been focusing on backward design of the major curriculum, in which teachers develop scaffolding assignments sequenced within the major to accelerate students' growth as disciplinary writers and thinkers. John is the author and co-author of several books on writing and reading rhetorically, but the one that caught my eye as the director of our center was the 2011 second edition of Engaging Ideas, the Professor's Guide to Integrating Writing, Critical Thinking, and Active Learning in the Classroom. John commuted here today by ferry from Vashon Island, where he and his wife Kit built their home in 1987. John is an avid Mariners baseball fan and hopes springs eternal. He and Kit like to bike, sea kayak, and spend time with their 4 grown children and their families, all of whom, he is blessed to tell you, live in the Seattle area. Those of you who have been around a while might remember that we also hosted John in 1998 during our last Gen Ed revision. John, it's lovely to have you back among us.
Thank you for that.
Make sure that's on.
I think it's on. Is it on? Okay. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be back. I always really like to talk about writing across curriculum, and I know that SPU is now starting a new kind of writing program and is looking to create first-year seminars and have a really strong writing across the curriculum project. I know a lot about SPU because of my friend Tom Emeritus. I don't know if you know that Tom and I both live on Vashon. We both specialized in Renaissance literature and Ret Comp. We're both members of the Church of the Holy Spirit at Scaffolding on Vashon. We're both interested in assessment and pedagogy, and we get together regularly for either breakfast or coffee to talk about what's going on at two schools. I've talked a lot about SBU, and he's talked a lot about Seattle University. My recent background, which I'm going to be focusing on largely today, comes from this Teagle Foundation assessment grant that Margaret mentioned in the introduction. This grant allowed us to conduct workshops for 70% of the undergraduate disciplines at Seattle University. And they did sort of an equivalent thing at Gonzaga. And these workshops were 2-day summer workshops. So you got a picture of a 2-day summer workshop with the English department, then one with the history department, one with the psychology department, one with chemistry, one with biology, etc. And these were run by a 3-person team who facilitated. So I was one of the people on the team. Larry Nichols, who's the director of our writing center, was on it. And then we were very fortunate and I think smart to include research librarians. So a research librarian participated in each of those. And we've just learned so much about how difficult it is actually for students to do sophisticated undergraduate research and how to use a library and how to figure out when you use the library and when you're doing field research and when you're working in a lab and how it all fits together. And so a lot of the things we'll be talking about today are insights that would not have been possible had it not been for having a librarian present on those. I want to just explain also that at least from my perspective, the goal of writing across the curriculum is not directly to improve student writing. I think it does improve student writing, but I like to think of the goal more as promoting deep learning in the discipline, because it's through well-designed writing assignments that you get students to learn to think like historians or think like biologists, etc. And so that the use of writing assignments, especially if you kind of get away from the big, large research paper at the end and think of maybe shorter assignments that are scaffolded throughout the term, that you can promote this kind of deep engagement. And so we'll be talking about various ways to do that. The results of writing across curriculum, it seems to me, you know it's working for you if you enjoy teaching more. And a lot of people think, well, how can I enjoy teaching more if I'm going to be adding all these writing assignments, I've got all this grading and stuff. If that's what you're thinking, it's not working yet for you. You gotta make it work for you. Because often we can, at least I think at Seattle University, our students write too much. We have too many writing assignments. And we'd be better off to have fewer writing assignments, and more of those fewer ones, the grammar here is a little complicated, more of those fewer ones would be brought to a higher level of excellence through more revision, etc. And so it's a kind of case of working together and working smart. So there isn't any one teacher that has to have a lot of writing. If you kind of think about how you could coordinate it throughout the curriculum. So I say you got to figure out a way to make it work for you. And there's no one right way to do it. And so today I'm going to present some of my views of what constitutes an effective writing assignment. But I invite you to disagree with me or to modify it or to say, well, that might work for him, but it's not going to work for me. You've got to make it fit your personality as a teacher, your discipline, your goals for your students. And there are just so many ways to do it that today I just give you brainstorming opportunity to think of different options that you might have. The plan for today is kind of shown on the first page of the handout. There's the introduction and then looking at the whole curriculum, Expert, Insider, Pros. Then we're going to be turning to your own course, expanding your assignment options. But before we get into the actual workshop itself, I'd like to just go over these 3 quotations on page 1 of the handout. You all have the handout, right? Okay. The first one is from Ken Bain, What the Best College Teachers Do. And Ken Bain was able to get the names from all sorts of universities and colleges across the United States, and I think also Canada, of just nominate who are the great teachers on your campus. And he did focus groups and questionnaires and interviews to try to figure out what all these great teachers did. And one of the things he discovered is they did not at all share the same teaching methods. Some of them were great teachers as lecturers, some worked with small groups, many different ways to teach. But one of the things they had in common was this. Highly effective teachers confront students with intriguing, beautiful, or important problems, authentic tasks that will challenge them to grapple with ideas, rethink their assumptions, and examine their mental models of reality. And that's how I think of a writing assignment. A good writing assignment ought to present a student with a beautiful problem from your discipline, or have them invent their own beautiful problems, have them teach them how to ask the questions themselves. And by beautiful problem, I mean there can be many sub-problems and small problems inside a larger beautiful problem. But you need to have students see why these matter. What's at stake in these questions? Why do people debate these questions? Why does it matter? The second quotation from Ann Beaufort, is someone that's influenced me a lot. She's done a lot of expert on novice-expert theory, trying to figure out what it is that makes a person move from novice to expert. And obviously, many hours of practice is one of the things it takes. But I like the way she words this. These scholars, that is, people working on novice-expert theory, these scholars conclude, after extensive research in the nature of expertise in many domains of knowledge, that the single most distinguishing characteristic of those who gain expertise in a variety of skills domains are those who continually assign themselves more and more complex problems to solve. For educators, this translates for a need for students to experience sequence writing assignments within and across courses in which skills required to complete the task build on previously acquired skills. That kind of gets at the notion of transfer. You know, and how can you promote transfer in a sophomore course from things that students learn in the first year courses? And how do you then promote transfer to the junior and senior level? And so much of what we've been experimenting with are ways to promote this kind of transfer. And that'll be apparent as we continue. And the last one, from an inquiry-based course in the laboratory course, inquiry-based writing in the laboratory course, the authors say design assignments for the curriculum rather than the individual course. And that's kind of the way of thinking I want to kind of promote at least a little bit here today, is that and it's a bit of restriction on academic freedom, because you're not then free just to teach any kind of way you want to in any course, but you have to say, in this particular course, we want students to write this kind of paper, and then get an agreement that anybody who teaches that course will do something like what you've agreed on. So it's all a matter of department collaboration and talk and getting together and deciding if you want to try doing that. On our campus, what's driven those conversations is the assessment movement. And I'll explain how that's worked as we continue. Okay, if you turn to page 2, I just want to start off by taking you back to 1985. And this was when I first really began doing the study of writing cross-curricular in a way where I thought, this is really interesting to me. I kind of want to do this rather than maybe continue just working primarily in Renaissance literature. It's kind of the transition as I really started moving into really thinking about pedagogy and things. And we had a large FIPSI grant called this is when I was at Montana State University before I came to Seattle University. And we had this large grant called the Montana State University Thinking Skills and Writing Project. And I had the opportunity to work with this Introduction to Psychology course. And so I was, in effect, taking this Introduction to Psychology while I was working on writing. So here's the scenario. Imagine that you are teaching an Introduction to Psychology course, primarily to first-year students early in their college careers. For the next class session, you want students to read the textbook chapter explaining some of the important modern schools of psychology. How might students' studying and thinking processes differ depending on the way you give the homework task? So role play now being a student, and you want them to read this. And so one thing you just say is read chapter 2. Or you could say read chapter 2 and be prepared for a quiz. Or you could say read chapter 2 and then write a one-page thinking piece that addresses the following question. Suppose you are a parent who goes to a child psychologist for advice on how to get your 10-year-old child to practice the piano. It seems the child rushes out of the room screaming every time you insist he practices. What different advice would you get if the child psychologist were a behaviorist, a psychoanalyst, or a humanistic psychologist? Come to class with your complete thinking piece and be prepared to share your ideas with classmates. So here's the discussion task I'd like you to do at your tables. If you decided to try out strategy 3, don't worry for now what you would do with all those thinking pieces. We'll deal with that question later. For now, just focus now. Each of these strategies might alter the way students study. Please explore with colleagues how students would read and study and think differently depending on how the homework was assigned. Now, I'm not asking you which of these is better, because I happen to like both thinking pieces and quizzes, and there's places for both of those. So it's not a question of which is better. It's just how would a first-year student study differently if you're given one versus the other. So I'll give you a couple minutes to just start thinking about that at your tables. So this is a little warm-up discussion. This isn't supposed to be, starting a heated debate that lasts the rest of the morning. But I would like to get maybe just a little bit of sense of what some of the people at some of the tables thought about the differences in the way students study. And I'm not going to try to walk around with a big microphone, so just shout really loud when you do it. Any volunteers to just offer how students would study differently? And again, not which one is better, but just how would they study differently?
I think if you think about Bloom's taxonomy and through the levels of thinking, for studying for a quiz, there may be more memorizing and just a lower level, whereas the second assignment or the third one gets to application and synthesis and higher levels.
Right, that's exactly right, and that's what we discovered, that if they're studying for a quiz, they tend to break the chapter into little pieces, little details, a lot of factoids. They'll memorize the dates for Freud, or they'll memorize dates for B.F. Skinner, or they'll memorize the definition of behaviorism or something like that. And so it's largely memory and recall. Now, you can construct quizzes that test at a higher level, but then you have to teach students how to do the reading that lets them learn at that higher level. Whereas the thinking piece, automatically, they're already applying the knowledge to a high-level, beautiful problem in the discipline. And this particular teacher really thought this was a beautiful problem in the discipline, because this teacher was a friend of mine who was a newly hired behaviorist. He did most of his research with rats in a department that had a very influential teacher who was really kind of a Rogerian, Carl Rogers kind of therapist type, and they intensely disliked each other. And they didn't use Rogerian conversation to talk to each other. But this teacher was very interested that students really began to see the implications of behaviorism, and so a lot of the assignments he developed were assignments to just learn about behaviorism. But he wanted to see that the experts disagree. And this is, a lot of students, come to college not realizing experts disagree. They assume that teachers know the answers, and I'm going to just feed back the answers. So very early on, you want to develop this kind of sense that you need to make arguments, and you need to apply the things that you've learned to these new sorts of problems. Now, another thing that we discovered from doing this is that the thinking pieces don't automatically teach students how to do that kind of thinking. I mean, students will read the chapter over and over, the section of the chapter over and over, talking about the different schools of modern psychology, and still not be able to apply it. But when they come to class, they tend to really be interested in what the teacher thinks. So that it's kind of like prepares them to really listen to the teacher this time, because they see that there's something that matters. There's something at stake here, that something does matter. So a lot of times what you're doing is just, they're not really accomplishing the high-level thinking you want, but they're ready to listen to you explain the high-level thinking. But for me, this exercise started to make me really think about the homework design of the course. And before doing this sort of thing, I would think when I was preparing a class what I would do in class. So on day 3, I want to cover this material, and then day 4, I want to cover this material, and day 5, I want to cover this material, without thinking about what do I want students to be thinking about while I'm covering this material. And ordinarily we just say read chapter 2, or finish Hamlet, or something like that, or do this problem set. But is there a way that you can give them a problem so that when they come to class, they've been thinking already at a high level about the material? So they process the material differently when you're given the thinking piece. Now, on page 2, there are 2 more readings I really suggest. They both happen to be from the journal Teaching Sociology. But there are other approaches to try to prepare students for discussion classes that get away from quizzes as a way of motivation. And both of these say that quizzes don't really teach deep reading, and they don't teach rhetorical reading. So you could try the kind of thinking piece approach that I'm recommending, or read Roberts and Roberts or Yaman and try their other things. So the The downside of quizzes, obviously, is you're not giving students a high-level problem that they're applying the material to. The downside of the thinking pieces is students sometimes skip over those details, and you want them to learn those details. So I kind of go back and forth between sometimes quizzes, sometimes thinking pieces. But the thinking piece is where my heart is, because that's where you can give students the beautiful problems. So I think I've invented maybe 50 or 60 beautiful problems about Hamlet, that I know any one of those will spark class discussion about Hamlet. And so I can just put them in anywhere. They can be start a day's discussion, or they can be a thinking piece, or they could be an exam, or they could be a small group of things. That's one of the things you'll be thinking about today, is just how many different kinds of really good critical thinking questions can you develop for your class, and where could you use them? So let's move on to page 3. Some general principles for teaching academic writing in the disciplines. And I don't need to read the whole thing, but just at the boldface level. First, establish your course goals. Then second, develop questions or problems that promote critical thinking about your course content. And that's most of what we'll be talking about today. Or strategies for going about doing that and sharing your ideas with colleagues. Then you'll pick up your colleagues' ideas also. Develop a repertoire of ways to give critical thinking problems to students. Think of writing assignments as a crucial part of course design. When assigning formal writing, treat writing as a process. And then develop scoring criteria and give them to students in advance. I'd like to go back and develop a couple of those in more detail. Establish your course goals. On the one hand, we automatically think of our subject matter goals, the new knowledge, the facts, concepts, theories, methods that you want students to learn. But we also think of the kind of thinking goals, or the conceptual, the procedural goals, goals for thinking within the discipline, new ways that you want students to see or think, disciplinary processes of critical thinking, inquiry, reading, analysis, and argument. So you're not only saying I want them to learn these facts about sociology, but I want to help them learn how to think like a sociologist. And in learning to think like the sociologist, or think like an historian, et cetera, that's where the design of the writing assignments makes so much difference. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail. And then under develop questions or problems that promote critical thinking, the second bullet. Highest level of critical thinking typically comes from messy, ill-structured, or open-ended problems with no algorithmically attained right answer. Problems that lead to a claim with supporting arguments. And so most of the research on critical thinking says the same thing. Critical thinking addresses these sorts of problems that don't have a single right answer. Instead, you have to make a claim with an argument. So you assume if you're making a claim with an argument, there are other ways to answer that, and you're pushing against some of these other ways as you write. So the critical thinker listens to all these different approaches. That's part of critical thinking, to try to make sense as much as you can of all the evidence that bears on it, and then try to figure out what's the best solution. Often the best solution comes from the values that you have to bring, and you have to be upfront about the values that I'm bringing to this particular discussion. But critical thinking involves that kind of wrestling with these open-ended problems. In some disciplines now, they're really moving to open-ended problems that are so difficult, they call them wicked problems. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but I'm increasingly interested in that notion of wicked problem, like what to do about healthcare in the United States is a wicked problem. One solution always brings with it so many problems that nobody seems to agree. But that's the idea, is fairly early on to introduce students to the sorts of questions in your discipline that create debate or create discussion. And then think of writing assignments as a crucial part of course design. The first bullet, reverse engineer your course by designing the final assignment first. This is the notion of kind of backward design. Because often this is the most comprehensive or the most difficult assignment at the end. And if you design that first, you can see, well, now, how could I do things early in the course to help prepare students for that paper later? And that's the kind of thinking then that helps develop scaffolding assignments. So is there some simple assignment that could be done early that maybe students could revise for a better grade until they really learn that kind of thinking, that then they can then apply to this later one? We do the same thing in design the curriculum. What do you want seniors to be able to write? And then what could we do at the junior or sophomore level, or even the first year level to help them do it? And then the last bullet, when designing a formal assignment, create or simulate an authentic rhetorical context, purpose, audience, and genre. And as we get more into the theory today, I'll show why that's particularly important. And I suggest getting rid of school genres, such as research paper, lab report, or term paper, and rethink what you want to call those. And we will talk about that today, too. Okay, if you'll turn to page 4, I now want to just give you a little background on the theory that has kind of shaped my way of thinking about the backward design of the curriculum, what we're trying to do in the curriculum. I've been very influenced by this book from 1994 by Susan Peck MacDonald called Professional Writing, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And this was a very unsettling book because it's essentially an argument against freshman English really working. So if you really believe in first-year composition, it's painful to read a book like this that shows it's a great dream, but it doesn't really work. And so she's really interested in changing faculty thinking about what students learn in first-year composition. And the kind of traditional way of thinking is that students learn to write in first-year composition. And now that they've learned to write, I don't have to worry about teaching writing in any of these other courses because the English department has done that in first-year composition. There's particularly a sense if students learn how to write a research paper in first-year composition, they then ought to be able to write a research paper in chemistry or a research paper in biology, et cetera. And Susan Peck MacDonald's research has shown that's simply not true. And so she talks about 4 stages that students go through. In stage 1, I'm reading out the top of page 4. Stage 1 is what students bring from high school, which she says is primarily non-academic or pseudo-academic writing. And this is not an attack on high school teachers at all, but it's just a fact that she says, for the most part, students in high school are not doing the kind of writing that we really want them to do in college. And so by non-academic, she talked about personal essays or maybe working on the school newspaper or things like that. Pseudo-academic writing, she's thinking specifically about things like the 5-paragraph essay or the high school book report, which is very different from a professional book review, et cetera. And you might learn a lot of things about writing that's not what you're trying to do in college. So she really believes in the value of first-year composition, even though she thinks it doesn't transfer, because her goal is to try to figure out how to make it transfer, right? So the goal of first-year composition is generalized academic writing, concerned with stating claims, offering evidence, respecting others' opinions, and learning how to write with authority. But she says that teachers need to see that that's generalized academic writing. That's not learning to think like an historian or write like a historian or think like a nurse. You see what I'm getting at, that the disciplines are so different. So she says that, so she then talks about stage 3, early courses in the major, which she calls novice approximations, particular disciplinary ways of making knowledge. And she's discovered that students who might have gotten a strong A in first-year composition suddenly fall apart when they're writing a sociology paper or something else. It's like, if you're such a good writer there, why can't you be such a good writer here? And she argues is that the disciplines are so different. The kinds of questions they ask are different. The kind of genres they want you to write in are different. What constitutes evidence is different. And students are just lost. They don't know how this new discipline works. And you can't expect freshman English to have taught them how this new discipline works. Eventually, she says, some students at least pick it up and they get it. And they're able to write expert insider prose within the discipline by the time they're seniors. And so her concern is how could you accelerate that a little bit? And she says you can accelerate it by changing the way you teach writing in stage 3. There's those early courses in the major that makes this huge difference, she said. So her point is, if students are not writing well as seniors, like, for example, you give them a kind of capstone paper in the senior year and they're not writing well, you cannot solve that problem by improving first-year composition. You can only solve that problem by improving the way that writing is taught inside the major, and then trying to figure out how to link that to first-year composition. And that's an exciting research field to try to do that. I mean, it's small liberal arts colleges that take the lead in making that happen. Another article that's really influenced me is this one by Michael Carter. This is the bottom of the page, Ways of Knowing, Doing, and Writing in the Disciplines. And he argues that at a large Research 1 university, an undergraduate might have as many as 120 different things you could major in. But they really fall, he argues, into kind of four meta disciplines. And each of these meta disciplines has its own meta genre. So I want you to be thinking about where your particular discipline might fall. At our institution, some of these disciplines have an easy answer to that question, like English department. We're going to identify themselves in a few minutes as interpretive theoretical discipline. Psychology is going to identify itself as an empirical research discipline, at least on our campus. But political science is all over the map on where they are. And so I want you to just kind of think of where you are personally in this schema and where your department as a whole is. So he says the four meta disciplines are problem-solving disciplines, empirical inquiry disciplines, interpretive theoretical disciplines, and performance disciplines. So the problem-solving disciplines are those in which professionals who have learned to think inside that discipline, what they do with that knowledge is solve problems for clients. So they're out in the real world analyzing the client's problem and then bringing their expertise to bear on that problem. So he says business, engineering, applied sciences are all problem-solving disciplines, where what you'd expect students to be able to do when they're seniors is look at some problem in the real world and bring their expertise to bear on it. So the meta-genre there is a proposal to solve a problem. And he argues that all students inside those problem-solving disciplines ought to have somewhere where they just learn the genre of the proposal, of posing a good question, demonstrating why posing a problem, demonstrating why the problem's a problem, explaining why it hasn't been solved before, offering a solution, and arguing why this solution is better than alternative solutions, and saying how much it will cost, etc. Related genres would be recommendation memo, a progress report, feasibility study, management plan, technical documentation. These are all in kind of the workplace disciplines. The next meta-genre is empirical inquiry discipline. Physical and social sciences doing discovery research. Their meta-genre is the experimental research report with an IMROD structure, that is introduction, methods, results, discussion. And students have to learn how to set up a good empirical problem, figure out a methodology to gather data, report the data in the results section, and then use that data to make an argument in the discussion section. And he says, obviously you can't expect to learn how to do that first-year composition when you're doing all these other things. So other related genres are ethnography, qualitative research article, a research proposal, poster, literature review article, descriptive statistical study, etc. The third group of disciplines he calls interpretive theoretical disciplines. That would be the humanities, in which the meta-genre is an academic argument addressing an interpretive question about a human artifact, often through a theoretical lens. So those disciplines advance by not solving the problem, moving on the way an empirical research one would, but often by moving into new theoretical approaches and looking at the same old material, this time through different lens, etc. So students in that field have to learn how to work with theory as well as learn how to make arguments with the artifacts. And so here the related, the genres are the academic article or book chapter, a conference paper, particularly you could call it an undergraduate research conference, a book review, informative pieces for lay audiences, a scholarly book, etc. And finally, there are the performance disciplines. And in the performance disciplines, the work of the discipline is not done in language. The work of the discipline is done in art or performance in some way. So visual arts, dance, music, performance. You could, of course, put creative writing in that. But you're not writing academic articles. That's not what you're trying to do. So the primary genre that students need to learn in that field is the reflection or critique, in which you try to explain why you did the performance this way rather than some other way. Who were the people that influenced you in this work of art? Who are you trying to be different from? Who are you trying to be similar from? Why did you make these choices rather than something else? But we found that our graduate psychology department has decided to call a therapy session a performance, and then have students write a reflection on that. So you can kind of see how that reflection is really important too. So you try to remember what happened in this therapy session. You try to, why did I do it this way? I might have done it some other way. What went right? What went wrong? So it's continued kind of cognitive thinking about what you did. So you can define performance in ways other than just pure artistic. So I'm going to then ask you in a few minutes to think about what your discipline is like. Is it a problem-solving discipline? Is it critical inquiry discipline? Is it interpretive theoretical discipline? Is it performance discipline? And what do you want then seniors to do? So if you turn to page 5, I want to set this up. And this is the way that Seattle University got its accreditation back. We almost lost accreditation. I don't know if this is widely known or not, because we did not have universal assessment going on. We had good pockets of assessment, but I can't remember the term they had, ongoing and systematic, universal, some language like that. It's like every department's supposed to do it. But we started doing it by focusing on writing in a large number of the departments. So here's what a prototype assessment project looked like. How well do our seniors, graduate students produce expert insider prose? Program faculty reach consensus on what constitutes an expert insider prose assignment for seniors. Some programs might already require capstone projects, senior thesis, or other kind of major disciplinary project for seniors. So you might already be doing that. An instructor embeds this assignment in an appropriate senior level course. The instructor grades the papers using a rubric, identifies the number of strong, okay, and weak unsatisfactory papers, and analyzes characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses. This is no extra work on the part of the instructor, because this is already an assignment was in there. You're simply, instead of reporting the grades as A's, B's, and C's, you report the grades along this rubric so you can operationalize the criteria. The instructor presents the results at a meeting of program faculty and leads discussion of problem areas. So we mandated that each department had to spend one department meeting just talking about this piece of writing that was embedded in the senior course. Faculty discuss ways that problems might be ameliorated early in the course or curriculum through improved assignments, instructional methods, or curriculum design. And then program faculty agree to pilot some changes in the next year, closing the loop. And an easy way to upgrade that is to have, say this professor had 20 students in this class, maybe have 4 or 5 of those papers read by other members of the department so you can have a little inter-rater reliability. And what we found at Seattle University, at least, is a large number of departments radically changed their curriculum within the next 3 or 4 years after starting to do that. The English department's almost totally different from what we now do. And I'm going to give you an example from social work here in a few minutes. Because we decided what we wanted seniors to do, but we realized we didn't have any place where you actually asked them to do it. So that means you've got to think of a course, and you're starting to design an assignment for the course. Anyway, here's the workshop discussion task. Bottom of page 5. Working with disciplinary colleagues, try to reach consensus on the following questions. What would constitute expert insider prose for undergraduates or graduate students in your discipline? Are all students completing your program currently required to write such a paper? If yes, how well do they generally do? What patterns of strengths and weaknesses occur? What recurring problems are particularly noticeable? And if no, where might such a paper be required or piloted? What would you predict their strengths and weaknesses would be? So I'd like to give you some time now at tables to just start discussing that. And I'm not expecting you to come up with consensus here. Just get this conversation started. Is it clear, though, what I'm asking you to do? Any questions? Okay. So the idea, this is just the, obviously the beginning of a conversation. It's not easy to make a decision on what you want to do. I'll just tell you a quick story about the English department. We decided as a department that we wanted our seniors to be able to do what we ended up calling a paper suitable for presentation at an undergraduate research conference. And we had a couple teachers in the department who already were giving assignments like that, but you'd only would do that assignment if you happen to take that teacher's course. So we decided to renumber our 300 and 400 level courses and make all the 400 level courses require such a paper. And then we can talk about how we did backward design later. But the idea is, if you have such a paper, is there already a place in the curriculum where you're requiring it, or do you need to kind of rethink that? And that's why this starts a long process of, over 3 or 4 or 5 years of rethinking through this. And so on our campus, the motivation for doing it became the campus assessment projects that you had to do. So. But these are very interesting discussions among colleagues. At least I've found they're very valuable. You really end up really learning more about what your colleagues are doing, figuring out ways to coordinate your efforts, etc. What I'd like to do before the break, and we'll have a break after this next segment, is talk about the skills, knowledge needed to produce expert insider prose. So if you turn to page 6, I have kind of 2 approaches. One approach It comes through the work of Ann Beaufort, and she's the one who did that novice expert research that I talked about at the beginning. The second approach is one kind of popularized by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein. Graff used to be the president of the Modern Language Association. He has a little book called They Say, I Say, which is a very sticky kind of title. And I think it's also quite useful. But if you turn to page 6, we'll look at what Ann Beaufort said that students really need to do if they're going to write expert insider prose. Obviously, they have to have subject matter knowledge, and that's right at the top. Conceptual knowledge, they have to know their discipline's facts, concepts, theories, methods. And procedural knowledge, their discipline's way of thinking, its methods, problem-solving strategies, ways of inquiry, uses of evidence, etc. She argues that most teachers in most disciplines spend most of their time teaching the conceptual knowledge of the field and kind of hope that people pick up the others just through osmosis. You know, so that by the time they're seniors, I ought to just do it because that's how we learn to do it. And she argues that you can accelerate that process a lot by making it more conscious. But in addition to simply knowing that subject matter knowledge, students also need genre knowledge, information literacy knowledge, rhetorical knowledge, and writing process knowledge. And she argues that all these things ought to be introduced in first-year composition. And then teachers in later disciplines ought to figure out ways to tie back into that knowledge. So in first-year composition, students ought to learn something about the difference between genres. So there's disciplinary work pace or civic conventions for style, format, documentation, and treatment of subject. So if a student says, can I put I in this paper, the student should not see that as an answer of the teacher's preference, but rather as a genre issue. Some genres you do say I, and some genres you don't say I. And it's not that I'm making up these idiosyncratic rules, it's how the genre works, and the genre is part of the kind of the social conventions of the readers who read that genre. So you have academic genres, journal articles, conference presentations, posters, experimental reports, etc. You have workplace genres, memos, instructions, reports, electronic genres, civic or popular genres, op-ed pieces, letters to the editor, etc. And students should just have the experience of knowing when you do this genre, you try to think, what does this genre require? If it's an op-ed piece, you're told, 500 words ought to be the maximum here. This is not a 1,500-word research paper, something like that. Students need a lot of information literacy, which is not only how to use the library databases, but how to ask the right questions, then how to find it on the databases, understanding different kinds of sources, knowing how to read and evaluate sources. Students should be introduced to that in first-year composition, but that doesn't just automatically transfer to your field on how you do a literature review in psychology or something. They need rhetorical knowledge, adapting text to audience and genre, understanding function of old and new information. What does the reader already know? What doesn't the reader know? Is the reader already interested in this question, or do I need to get the audience interested in this question? Anytime you write your own professional article, you're always wrestling with these rhetorical questions right from the beginning, even to what should I have as the title, because you know the rhetorical function of the title. Students don't know that until they start thinking about genre. They think a good title is my paper, or paper number 3. And so all these things in which you try to think about what the impact of this piece of writing is going to have on the reader is part of what rhetorical knowledge is. And then writing process knowledge, of course, is the whole notion that you have to go through rough drafts, that a lot of students think that experienced writers don't need to go through rough drafts. They don't realize that experienced writers go through rough drafts more extensively than do novice writers. Many more drafts. So all this needs to be taught in first-year composition, but it needs to be reinforced in the disciplines, and disciplines need to think how to transfer that kind of basic first-year composition knowledge into something that's more specific for their discipline. So you see when we get to designing writing assignments later this morning, I'm going to suggest you put a rhetorical context into your assignment, an audience, a genre, and a purpose for the writer, and you'll see how that works. The next one is teaching the big picture moves of academic argument. And this, again, is influenced by They Say, I Say. And these weren't new ideas in They Say, I Say, but just made wonderfully sticky. But because teachers for a long time have been saying that the main academic move is kind of pushing against what others have said. So some scholars have said X, but I'm going to argue Y. That's kind of the sort of the basic move that we do in all disciplines. And students need to see that the thesis statement is in competition or in conflict in some way with another thesis, with an alternative way of saying, and that's why you need to support your view with an argument. If the audience already agreed with you completely, you wouldn't need an argument. So students need to see then that academic writing is initiated by a problem, either one assigned by the instructor or developed by the student. And that's what I'm going to suggest throughout the morning, is get away from the word topic. Don't assign students a topic, assign them a problem. Or if you want to give them broad topic area, then tell them they need to convert that topic into their own problem. So you're teaching them how to do it. Because academic writing begins with a question or problem. It doesn't just begin with a topic area. In a prototype academic paper in any discipline, the introduction explains the problem at issue, positions the paper in a conversation, and motivates the reader by showing the problem's significance. The length of an introduction is a function of how much the reader already knows about and cares about the problem. So this is kind of part of the assignment. You've got to set up who this reader is. And where's the reader coming from? Because in a way, academic writing tries to change the reader's view in some way. Before reading my paper, my readers will think this. But after reading my paper, my readers will think this new way. You're trying to move them in some way towards this new way. And that's where rhetorical knowledge comes in. And how do you make that move happen? So a thesis statement is in tension with some kind of counter-thesis, alternative viewpoint, or possibly different answer to the thesis question. What Graff and Birkenstein have called the they say, I say move. And then different academic genres have different ways of making the they say, I say move. For example, in an experimental report, the part of the report that's most like a thesis-governed first-year composition essay would be the discussion section, because when you get to the discussion section, you're now arguing, do these data support or not support this hypothesis? But the writer's critical thinking begins to emerge in the discussion section. That's something just students need to learn. So I kind of think then that students need to learn 3 moves. I'm looking now at the bottom of page 7. The problem-posing move, we got the problem at the top, then the they-say move and the I-say move. So the they-say move emerges from uncovering the critical conversation surrounding the problem. Who are these theys that I'm going to push against? In advanced papers, these theys could be disciplinary scholars, where you've done a pretty good literature review. But in first year or in a lot of classes, it could be just other classmates. Jill believes this, but I'm going to argue this. And just to have some sense of this other view out there that you're pushing against. It could be participants in civic political debates. So, and assuming it's more than classmates, then how do I find them? This is the use of the library, information literacy. How do I read them rhetorically? How do I summarize them for new readers? How do I position myself within this conversation? And it prepares ground for writing discipline-specific literature reviews. Now, in our experience at Seattle University, this is the thing that's most fallen through the cracks in most disciplines. There's no place in the discipline where students actually are taught how to do this. You always assume somebody else has done it or they learned in first-year composition. But it's really actually very difficult to teach students how to do a literature review that fits your discipline. So I kind of have 3 different kinds of literature review. The gap in knowledge literature review is typically what you do in empirical research discipline, where you try to show that we've learned so far through previous research, we've learned X, Y, and Z, but we haven't yet figured out A. This experiment's going to be focusing on A. You're trying to find something that's not known. But that's a hard skill to learn, because students want to just summarize the first thing they read and then summarize the second thing they read and summarize the third thing they read with no sense of any purpose in this other than chronological order. This is the first one I read, this is the second one I read. They're not seeing how these experiments talk to each other and how they're trying to open up some kind of gap. And so if you don't teach that in your discipline, students aren't going to learn it. And then when they write their senior paper, you're going to say, oh, the literature reviews are awful. But it's also important whether your discipline wants undergraduate students to do that. When I've talked about what we do at Seattle University with my friends at the University of Washington, they don't like what we're doing at Seattle University. We don't want any of our students to be wrestling with other scholars, et cetera. That's for graduate students. And so, this is really complicated. There's not universal agreement on what it is we should do. The state-of-the-art literature review comes from problem-posing disciplines. Now, we have a senior engineering design project that students have been doing in engineering for a long time, and a universal problem has been that students start solving their design problem before they've done any research on what others have done with that same problem. And a state-of-the-art literature review tries to demonstrate to a client that you've read the most recent literature, that you're bringing to bear on this problem the most recent knowledge. And so you're not trying to find a gap, you're trying to say we're on top of it. We have the best information that we're going to apply to your problem, because we're not doing a research. We're not trying to say this bridge may or may not work. That's not that's not rhetorically a good move. And then establish a controversy literature review tends to do what most humanities disciplines do, where you wouldn't ever think of reviewing everything that's been said about your problem, but you're really trying to find some critic or some scholar you can set up in the introduction that you're going to push against in some way. At least that's the most typical way to do it. So when we're teaching how to do this kind of literature review in English, we say you're not going to the literature to find the answer to your question. You're going to the literature to find someone you disagree with, because your paper is going to be your answer to the question. You're making your own argument. That's the I say move. So the they say move is summing up what other people have said, but then students have to see that they have to have their own voice, and this is the I say move. I say emerges from my own critical thinking. It is a meaning-constructing activity that presents my own contribution to the conversation. Evidence to support my thesis depends on the discipline and the nature of the question. So this evidence may come from my own analysis of an artifact or phenomenon. So how do you draw information from a painting to make an artistic argument or an argument about art criticism? It may come from laboratory experiments or other methods of empirical research. It may come from field research, observations, interviews, questionnaires, or other means of quantitative or qualitative research. It may come from library, database, archival research, the way historians would. In some cases, it may come from personal experience, but students need to learn how to make their own arguments. So I'm not asking you to do these departmental discussion questions at the bottom of the page here, but this is the kind of question that you could do to further these conversations in your departments. So where in your program's curriculum do students practice the following? Posing their own disciplinary problems, reading your discipline's scholarly literature or primary text in order to summarize, analyze, and evaluate what others have said, often as a point of departure for their own views, making their own disciplinary arguments within appropriate genres supported with disciplinary methods and evidence. And then how might your curriculum be better sequenced or coordinated to teach these skills, possibly using newly designed assignments or teaching methods? Now I'm going to finish this first part, and then we'll take a break, looking at the way the social work department has redesigned their curriculum as a result of these discussions. Before doing it, I just want to look at two rubrics developed by other departments for capstone papers, just to get a sense of what other people are doing in some fields, because you got to decide what you want to do at the undergraduate level here. So page 8 is a rubric for an economics capstone paper. And it comes from the Department of Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. But it's really clear that they are thinking in terms of the they say, I say move. So, and not because they borrowed it, because that they say, I say move is what critics do, what scholars do. So there's a problem-posing move. If you look over on 5 points in the column labeled 5, question clear by the end of the opening paragraph. Well motivated using current economic policy debate. Rest of paper consistently focuses on the question. And then there's a section on theory, a section on empirical literature review, which clearly depends on students being able to do the they say move. Evidence through critical appreciation, evaluation of relevant theory, outstanding coverage of relevant issues, use of a range of relevant sources in a critical way, showing an understanding of their contributions and value in answering the question, integrates well into the essay. So that's the they say part of what they want econ majors to do. And then the empirical contribution and conclusions is the I say. This is how the student now takes his or her own skills as an economist and uses it to make a new argument that enters this conversation. Notice there's a row on writing at the bottom. But we're really not talking about teaching writing here. We're talking about thinking like an economist. That's why I like the term expert, insider, prose. The next rubric is organized very differently. This is Duke University's biology thesis. What I like about it is they have a strong online presence, and you can look this up. And so BioTAP stands for Biology Thesis Assessment Protocol. So that must be science language for rubric. The BioTAP rubric assesses higher order writing issues, question 1 through 5, mid and lower order writing issues, questions 6 through 9, and accuracy and appropriateness of students' research, questions 10 through 13. For each question, a no answer indicates that the thesis does not meet the department's minimal acceptable standards. A somewhat rating indicates that the thesis meets the department's minimum standards, but not the standards of excellence. A yes response reflects the department's standards of excellence. Descriptions of each element of the rubric as well as departmental standards can be found out, and then that's the URL to find it. But notice the first question is very rhetorical. Is the writing appropriate for the target audience? And the second one puts the they say and I say move together into one question. Does the thesis make a compelling argument for the significance of the student's research within the context of the current literature? So you can go online and look at that if you're interested in that. And I'm using those just to say that, just to illustrate how some departments have set up rubrics for seniors that do kind of move around the genre knowledge, rhetorical knowledge, information literacy knowledge, et cetera, and that also really see this they say, I say move, with the they say coming out of reading the scholarship. And so you've got to decide for on your own, whether you want students to do this kind of expert insider prose that does look like it's preparation for graduate school, does kind of have a feel. But it's something that the department itself has to decide. The social work curriculum on page 10, fairly early on, made a clear decision. Question? Sure.
The I say is implicit in the they say as well, right? I mean, I was wondering, undergrads might not necessarily capture that, or freshmen or something, but like when you're pointing to a gap in knowledge in the literature, you're already interpreting.
Yes.
Your I say
yes.
is already there. So
yes.
Aren't you really kind of getting someone to read the literature knowing, backward plan from I say, so that there's that they say is contextual?
Yes. Yeah, that's beautifully expressed. Yeah, I would agree completely, because there's a great deal of my own critical thinking going in the way that I do the they say. You're right, yeah. Okay, good. If you go to page 10, the social work had for a long time had this capstone paper, and they complained it was just awful, that students did a very poor job about it. They would continually complain to the English department that we needed to improve the way we taught the research paper in first year composition, and couldn't we please use APA style instead of MLA style, because that's what they needed. And this is the thing that people in composition, it just breaks their hearts, because you just don't know how to answer that, because there's so much you want to say about you. It's too much to try to cover in first year composition. Students need to do this gradually. You need to help them. And so the social work department suddenly said, yeah, okay, we can do that. And they simply picked required courses in the curriculum: social work 250, social work 301, 304, 410, and 490. 490 is the one they'd always had that had this capstone paper. And they simply put other writing assignments earlier, designed for the curriculum rather than the course. So the agreement is anybody who teaches 250 has to do it. And they might have 2 or 3 different teachers go through it, but they all agreed to do it. And the main thing is that nobody was teaching this they say move in the curriculum. So in SOC 250, the assignment is an annotated bibliography of 5 articles using APA style on an area of interest within the field of social work. And the learning activities require parents' pocket guide to APA. If the English department isn't going to do it, we'll just do it ourselves. Arrange instruction section with the library liaison, exposure to social work scholarly research journals, provide an opportunity for practice of skills, understanding and summarizing in class. So here they just summarize these articles. Social Work 301, the assignment is to choose an area of concern, impact of divorce, which intersects with a life stage, i.e. adolescence, and write a short literature review utilizing and citing 5 scholarly peer-reviewed articles. Review APA formatting appropriate sources. So here they're beginning now to actually have the 5 articles related and try to figure out how to do a literature review in it. Social Work 304, they said, you know, there's another really important genre that we want all our social work students to do, and that's to write a policy brief, because they want social workers to also be able to influence public policy. So they get away from the research paper here and do this policy brief. So the assignment is develop a policy brief, and then they have to participate in a lobby day in Olympia, write a letter to the editor, understand the components of a policy brief. So it's a different genre that they think is important. And then 410 is now scaffolding for 490. They start doing their 490 research in 410. So they write and present a group proposal for task or treatment group for population served at a community social service or healthcare agency, containing a literature review of the social problem and treatment modality, group description, purpose, goals, agency sponsorship, et cetera, all the things that the students later are going to have to do individually. And then 490 is back to the same capstone paper that they had before. Senior research project paper includes abstract, literature review, description of assessment methods, demonstration of assessment and theory, application coursework, et cetera. Their experience over the last 3 or 4 years is that the quality of student writing the senior year has improved significantly, and they're doing conference papers on the results and things like that. So I bring that in just then as an example of how one department has changed its curriculum on the basis of thinking of writing this way. So what I'd like to suggest now is we take a break. Margaret suggested 10 minutes, and she will call it back into order, and I think the lapel mic will be fixed by then. And when we come back, we're going to just start switching to your own course and just thinking about a course you currently teach. So when you come back, just have in mind a course that you'd like to just think about writing assignments in. And if it's one that you already have a writing assignment in, if you have a draft of it, great. If not, be just thinking about what you've asked before. And so we'll switch now from talking about the curriculum as a whole to focusing on your own course. That make sense? Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Okay, if you turn to page 11, we're on designing an effective assignment handout. And I'm going to just go over this handout and then go over kind of 3 examples of assignments that kind of follow the model from this handout. And then the next particular discussion group the discussion time is going to come on the bottom of 13. So if you just look at the bottom of 13, you can kind of see what the issues are going to be. So in a few minutes, we're going to do this workshop discussion. For one of your courses, rework a current writing assignment or design a new one that presents a subject matter problem set within a rhetorical context, a purpose, audience, and genre. And then share your assignment draft with 1 or 2 colleagues. Discuss what might have been new, challenging, or difficult in thinking about writing assignments in this way. Also share your reservations or skepticisms about this approach to assignment design. So I want to just emphasize, I'm not telling you here the right way to design an assignment. I'm telling you my kind of recommendation for writing an assignment, like a claim that I've tried to support with some reasons and evidence, but there are a lot of good writing assignments that don't follow this format. So it's not like there's this right way and you look at your assignment and say, oh, I've been doing it all wrong. That's not what I want you to think about at all. But I would like you to try to see what the advantages might be of this particular approach. So reading on page 11, formal writing assignments can best promote the skills knowledge needed for expert insider prose. That is subject matter knowledge, genre knowledge, information literacy, rhetorical knowledge, and writing process knowledge. And that was from our handout on page 6. If they place a subject matter problem within a rhetorical context, such an assignment would include the following elements. A problem-based task. State the subject matter question, problem, or issue that you want students to address. You can give all students the same problem. You could give students a choice of problems or ask students to pose their own problems. Note, if you give students a topic rather than the problem, they may try to cover the topic with information, what I call an all-about paper, rather than writing an analysis or argument responding to a problem. And it's that notion of narrowing it down to a problem or question. And when I say give students all the same problem, remember that if it's a real problem, they'll all start with the same problem, but they won't have the same answers because there's so many different positions you can take in terms of what your own thesis might be. So there's a lot of room for disagreement and change, and I mean disagreement and variety and different kinds of answers or essays in response to the same problem. An advantage of giving them all the same problem is then you can really use class time to set up debates, small group discussions. There's just a lot of things you can teach about thinking in your discipline if everybody in the class is working on the same problem. But many people think, I want students to have a lot of choice or variety, and they have different problems. So you can give them a choice of different ones, or you can have them create their own. But if you give them a topic, tell them you have to turn that into a problem, and then you have to teach them how to do that, or have to help give them guided practice in how to do that. But then also rhetorical context, real or stipulated. Writers need to write for a purpose to an audience within a genre. Audience, the targeted readers who will be potentially interested in the writer's problem and argument. Writer's role or purpose. The writer's purpose can often be described in terms of the effect the writing should have on an audience, what the writer wants the audience to know, believe, or do as a result of reading the paper. And if you see the paper is primarily argumentative, then in some way you're trying to change the writer's view. Before reading my paper, my writers will have thought this, but after reading my paper, my writers will have thought this. But if the paper is mostly informative, so that what the writer is doing is bringing new information, then what you're kind of pushing against here is the reader didn't understand this before. So before reading my paper, my readers will know very little about this interesting topic. After reading my paper, my readers will know more about this interesting topic. But again, that can turn into an all-about paper or a Wikipedia article if you're not careful how you frame it. And then the genre. Students need to learn the conventions of specific genres such as experimental report, memo, proposal, academic argument, or analysis. Also specify requirements for format, length, documentation style, and so forth. Evaluation criteria. I suggest that you create a rubric to show your grading criteria and that you include the rubric in the assignment handout. Sometimes when I'm operating fast and I vet a new assignment, I have to give them the assignment before I've had time to make the rubric. And then I put off making the rubric, and then by the time I read the papers, I said, oh, I wish I'd made the rubric. But then the next time you do it, you can have the rubric already done. So sometimes you have to take 2 years before you can make the cycle really work. And in process, for longer assignments, explain the process you expect, due dates for drafts, peer reviews, visits to writing center, and so forth. Now this note on audience. When specifying an audience in an assignment, the instructor also needs to help students visualize the audience's initial stance towards the writer's subject. The instructor's goal is to move students toward a thesis with tension, what Graff and Birkenstein call the they say, I say move. Many people think X, but I'm going to argue Y. Or before reading my paper, my reader will think X. After reading my paper, my reader will think Y. The writer's goal is to change in some way the reader's initial stance or view. So you could set it up this way. Your classmate is confused about X or disagrees with you about X. Send him or her an email that. Or your readers doubt that these data support the hypothesis. In your discussion section, make your case but with appropriate hedges. Or scholars are divided about X. Write a formal academic paper presenting your position on this disciplinary problem. Imagine presenting the paper at an undergraduate research conference where listeners are apt to be skeptical of your thesis. Or you are a research assistant to Senator Smith who needs to decide X. Write a policy brief that. So when you think about audience, not just write to your classmates, but write to a particular segment of your classmates who in some way need your writing, or in some way you want to influence your writing. So you want to find a classmate that disagrees with you, or a classmate who's skeptical, or a classmate who doesn't believe this is an important topic. So that you're somehow moving that writer to the state that you want them at the end. So I'm now going to give you 3 examples. And all of these are what I would call scaffolding examples. They're not the main major paper due at the end of the undergraduate career, like a capstone paper. And in most cases, they're not the final paper for the course. It might be leading up to a final paper. And so here's one from literature. Literature assignment on Eve and Paradise Lost. Was Milton a misogynist? Renaissance misogynist writers typically tell the Adam and Eve story to justify patriarchy and warn men about women's seductive and deceitful nature. You wonder whether Milton in Paradise Lost has similarly misogynistic views of Eve. To extend your thinking, you have read Milton's Bogey, Patriarchal Poetry and Women Readers, from Sandy Gilbert's and Susan Gabar's classic feminist study of 19th century women novelists, The Mad Woman in the Attic. And this particular article really argues that Milton is a misogynist. It's maybe the most famous argument made about Milton, about his misogyny. And it's one of the beautiful problems in Milton. Your task, write a 3 to 4 page paper, double-spaced, that provides your answer to the question, does Paradise Lost reproduce the misogynist view of Eve frequently encountered in Renaissance anti-feminist discourse? Besides providing your own well-supported argument addressing this question, your paper must be in conversation with Gilbert and Gabar's views about Milton's misogyny in Paradise Lost. You can either disagree with Gilbert and Gabar, or you can incorporate and extend their views in some way. Your paper should thus include a summary of Gilbert and Gabar's argument about the view of Eve in Paradise Lost, as well as your own argument addressing the assigned question. So you can see that this is trying to teach the they say, I say move, but instead of a full-blown research paper, just one article that everybody has read, so you can talk about that article in class, and then you can have big debates about Paradise Lost, whether or not Gilbert and Gabar are right. Audience and genre. This should be a short academic paper in MLA style addressed to pure English majors wrestling with the problem of Eve in Paradise Lost. Assume your audience has read Paradise Lost but not Milton's Bogey. And this is just managing old and new information. You always, in literary criticism, assume that the reader has read the article that you're writing about or the work. So it'd be, you'd reveal yourself as naive if you summarize Paradise Lost. But you assume that they haven't read Milton's Bogey, so you do need to summarize that. So just kind of a way, why do you need to summarize Milton's Bogey? Because the audience has not read it, or you assume they haven't. You do not need to summarize Paradise Lost because you assume the audience has read it, because that's the convention of how you write in this discipline. Assume that your readers are either still confused about Eve or inclined to disagree with your view. Assume also that your audience hasn't read this assignment sheet. Therefore, you must set up the question in your introduction and hook your reader's interest through your title and opening paragraph. So you can kind of teach what happens in undergraduate research conference to turn it into a real genre. So you kind of explain undergraduate research conference. There might be this panel that has 3 different papers about Renaissance literature, 3 panels about Milton, and you're going to be hooked to go to this on the basis of the title. And so the title has got to, that's what gets the reader in. And that, once they start thinking about this way, then they start thinking the importance of a title, and they're starting to think rhetorically, because they can't write their title until they figure out their thesis, obviously. And the fact, in trying to revise the title, it always means you're revising your thinking about what you're doing. So the title always moves and morphs the way the paper does as you go through drafts. And then the introduction also has to set up the interest, because you just can't start. You've got to tell them what the question is before the answer. So they need the question before they need the answer. The point is that you teach them then how to kind of shake hands with the reader and set up the problem. And so the introduction, then you hook their interest through the title and the opening paragraph. And then there was a grading rubric for this paper, which I haven't reproduced. Okay, the second one is from Intermediate Microeconomics, a recommendation memo to a lay audience. And the economics faculty as a whole, along with finance faculty, have agreed that they want expert writers in their discipline to be able to address a lay audience as well as an audience of other economists. And they think for undergraduates, writing to a lay audience forces a deeper level of learning than writing to an insider audience, because they can't fall back on jargon and just assume, well, I know, of course, what this means, and you know what this means. But when you have to explain it to a lay audience, you really have to be at a deeper level. So you are an economics intern for State Representative Jane Smith to provide economics expertise on a legislative issue. Faced with budget deficits, Representative Smith is considering proposing an increased state gasoline tax as a new source of state revenue. She asks you to write a 2-page recommendation memo for or against raising the gas tax based on your economic analysis of the potential revenue that could be raised through such a tax, as well as on your own evaluation of the pros and cons of the tax. Include at least 1 graph, not counted toward the 2-page limit. Representative Smith is not an economist and is extremely busy. All writing has to be clear, concise, accurate, and understandable to a lay audience. So this is a 2-page recommendation memo. You can see in terms of grading, this is a lot better than a 12-page or 15-page research paper. But behind the scenes, this actually requires a lot of research. And this is where working with the research librarian has helped them figure out a way earlier in the course to give them. They've got to find out, for example, what the elasticity of gasoline is. And is there a debate about that? Have other critics or have other economists computed that? They've got to know how much gasoline is sold in the state, all that information, what the current tax is, et cetera. And apparently, if you're an economist, you know how to do an algorithmic tool that will tell you what the maximum revenue would be. So if you price gas too high, people stop driving and the state won't get any revenue. Or if you price it too low, everybody will be driving, but the state won't get its maximum revenue. So you can figure out what the maximum revenue would be. But then you've got the policy problem. Is this good? Who would be the winners? Who would be the losers if you did it that way? So it's not only just saying, here's the price for the maximum revenue, but who would be hurt? And then you've got to make your own political decisions. Do you want to do that? So the memo forces you to think like an economist, but also to think like a citizen making responsible recommendations. Students, this professor reports really liking to read these papers and having students really find that engage them, and they really see what matters as an economist. They can see how all this algorithmic stuff they've been learning, where they do problem set after problem set, how it really lets them help make public policy decisions and what's at stake. The last example on page 13, and I have included the rubric in this one, is for a freshman inquiry seminar, Environmental Issues. And this particular course, the inquiry seminars at Seattle University require some of these courses to include numeracy, that is, arguing with data. And so this is an assignment that forces students to look at data. Telling a surprising energy story with words and graphics. The assignment. You're a technical writer for an environmental organization that advocates for a coherent national energy policy. Periodically, this organization publishes one-page informational pieces aimed at the general public. Typically, the organization buys newspaper space for the pieces, which are desktop published in a 2-column format that wraps around one or more inserted visuals. See attached example. And you can all picture what these would look like, a full-page ad in the New York Times or in the Seattle Times. You are asked to write one of these one-page informational pieces on some meaningful story related to energy production and consumption as shown in the table 888, energy supply and disposition, and so on, that was provided. Your goal is to pull information from the table to raise public consciousness about an environmental problem. You must include at least one graph. Ideally, your information will be surprising to your intended readers, telling them something that runs counter to their current assumption about energy use. So the table might reveal something surprising about how much we import oil from a certain country, or about how little of the national energy usage comes from wind power, or something like that, something that the average reader isn't really expected to just realize initially, and you want to kind of make that story stand out. And then the idea here that what this teacher wanted to do was show how to insert a graph into a paper, because students often don't know how to do that. And so the quality of the contents tells a significant energy story. I'm looking now at the rubric. Increases readers' understanding of an environmental problem related to energy, has a clear informative purpose aimed at raising consciousness, uses new or surprising information to change readers' original view about some aspect of energy production or consumption. Tells an effective, significant story about energy. But then the quality of the graphics. Graphics are visually appealing and easy to read. Graphics have effective titles that refer to all pertinent dimensions of the graphic, both axes and legends. Graphics have effective labels and legends. Graphics are effectively referenced in the text. And then there's the graph and the words have to tell the same story. So follows principles of independent redundancy, tells in words the same story told by the graphic. Chooses effective details from the graphic to highlight the graphic's message. Is easy to follow. Reader readily sees how graphics support story and stories support graphics. So a lot of students writing in technical or scientific issues will plop a graph in, but then not reference it, and then not tell the reader what they're supposed to see inside that graph. So it's a skill that doesn't take very long to learn, but somebody somewhere in the curriculum needs to teach it, and that's what this teacher is trying to do. So now the workshop discussion at the bottom of that page. For one of your courses, rework a current writing assignment or design a new one that presents a subject matter problem set within a rhetorical context of purpose, audience, and genre. And then share your assignment draft with one or two colleagues. Discuss what might have been new, challenging, or difficult in thinking about writing assignments in this way. Also, share your reservations or skepticism about this approach. Now, I'm kind of thinking out loud that this could be maybe like 5 minutes of working on your own and about 8 to 10 minutes of sharing. But some of you might want to just start talking to someone else right away. But I'd really like you to just see what it's like to try to make the assignment a problem set within a rhetorical context if you haven't already done that. So is the task clear, what I'm asking you to try out? Okay, do it. Extend this discussion. So I'm only going to stop you for a little bit, and then you're going to be back talking about your own course again. I want to just add another kind of level of thinking to this discussion of assignments for your own course. Again, with the understanding that it takes a lot of thinking and kind of walking around campus and thinking at home and driving and stuff like that, coming up with different assignment ideas to finally hone what you want to do. And you've been now thinking about one assignment to be kind of a formal assignment, but I also want you to think about all the different ways you could create beautiful problems for your class that wouldn't necessarily have to be a full assignment. They could just be in-class free writes or something like that. And I'd like everybody to experience, if you haven't done this before, experience an in-class free write. And an in-class free write you can do anytime you give your students a problem that you really want to have good class discussion on, has a lot of different points of view. And you know, when you ask a question in class, sometimes the hands goes immediately in the air and you want people to wait a bit. You don't want to start calling on the first person. You want time to do it. Well, one way to do it is just give them an in-class free write and say, we're going to free write on this for 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes or sometimes 10 minutes. And students have to learn what we mean by free writing. And so I'd really like you to actually humor me and actually try it. And free writing suggests that once you get pen in hand and start writing or typing at a keyboard, you don't stop for that full limit. You just keep writing. And after a while, you run out of ideas, and you want to quit. And when you run out of ideas and want to quit, just say, this is stupid, or arg, or I hate this, or something like that, because eventually you get tired of doing that, and then a new idea will pop into your mind. And there's been a lot of research on free writing that suggests that the best ideas come late in the free write rather than early in the free write. When you first start, you're kind of free writing what everybody would say, the obvious things. You kind of run out of stuff to say. And then you go through this kind of fallow period where you can't think of anything. And then suddenly new ideas begin to come. And it's that second half where the new ideas come. And so when you practice this, you got to decide, do I want to do 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes? What I'd like to do is, I originally planned for you to do 2 4-minute free writes, but in interest of having more talking time, we'll just do 1. But if you turn to page 14, I want you to think again about your course. And then bring to mind your most important goals for your course. The goals for conceptual knowledge and the goals for procedural knowledge. And I'll stop for just a minute here while you just look at that and jot down little notes for what is the new stuff you want to bring into this course, or the new procedural knowledge. So just the top half under step 1, just be thinking for a couple minutes. This is not free writing yet. This is just free writing and note-taking. Okay, now I'm going to give you a 4-minute free write. And when I say start, you just write, and your pen keeps moving. That's the rule. You got to keep moving. But I have both free write 1 and free write 2. You can choose either one, or you can combine them into one. So free write 1 are, what are the most difficult aspects of this course for your students? What concepts or ideas are hardest for them to grasp? What ways of thinking are hardest for them to learn? And sometimes it's very useful to go through and say, where have students struggled? Because this might be the place where I could intervene with some kind of critical thinking task or writing assignment. And then free write 2, what are the most valuable or important parts of your course? What are your course's big questions? what concepts or ways of thinking are essential to students to master from your course. So Free Write 1 is about hardest, Free Write 2 is about what's most important. Choose one or the other or combine them into one. Is it clear what I'm going to ask you to do? Because I'm going to say start free writing. And if I'm doing this in class, I will free write with the students. And my answer will be just out there with the others. In a workshop setting, I get too nervous to do that. So I'm not going to do that. But I'll watch you do it, and I'm going to time it. Okay, start. Stop. That was 4 minutes. So what I'd like you to do now, this is the last little exercise before we open up kind of general questions and answers at the end. But I just want you to expand some of the ideas now that came from your thinking a little bit more deeply about your course. And so I'm going to give you one more exercise to do. Then when you begin talking about it, you'll have an extended more things to talk about with your colleagues. So if you turn to page 15, we have 8 ideas for creating problem-based tasks for exploratory writing, small group exercises, or scaffolding assignments. And 15 and 16 has 8 ideas, which I'll give you in a minute. You can just do these on your own. Just read it on your own, because that'd be much faster than my going through it. And as you're going through it, try to see which of these things you might do in your own class. So you could ask students to explain a course concept to a new learner, develop a controversial thesis in your field, give them a problem, give them a data set, etc. Those are the ideas on page 15 and 16. And then the workshop discussion is going to be this, on the bottom of 16. Thinking about the most difficult concepts or ways of thinking in your course, or about your course's big questions or most important features, peruse these 8 ways to create problem-based tasks for your course. These tasks could be used for in-class free writes, out-of-class thinking pieces, small group discussion tasks, short scaffolding assignments, or major papers. The purpose of these tasks is to help students learn a difficult course concept, develop a value critical thinking skill, learn certain disciplinary ways of seeing, or wrestle with the difficult reading. So on your own, spend 5 minutes thinking of ideas and jotting down ideas, and then share your thinking. And I'd like to kind of end this at 11:45, and that would give us 15 minutes at the end for kind of final discussion. So take 5, 6, 7 minutes to read through it and see which of these you might be able to do in your class, and then start a conversation at your tables. We now have about just a little over 15 minutes left before noon, and we'll quit right at noon. What I'd like to do is just get some of the tables thinking about some of these different sorts of assignments, these critical thinking problems, just get some examples of it. And then open it up to kind of just general questions, and you might have things you'd particularly like to ask that I could try to respond to, or start a conversation that have other people respond. The last 2 pages of the handout are just my explanations of ideas for why I like exploratory writing so much, and why I use it a lot in my classes. And so you can read those on your own, and if you have any particular questions about exploratory writing, about how I do it, I'd be happy to answer that. But first, I'd like to get just some sense of some of the different ideas for assignments that came up. So the first one is ask students to explain a course concept. There's a lot of recent research on what a lot of people are calling threshold concepts. Threshold concept being kind of an idea in a discipline. If a student learns that and really understands that concept, it's like they enter through this doorway and they see the whole discipline differently. Apparently in economics, if a student can explain what opportunity costs are, they've moved a long ways into thinking like an economist. And it's like before they enter that field, they're still thinking like novices. They explain the opportunity costs, and they're suddenly inside the field, or starting to get inside the field. Did any groups come up with any just examples of a difficult concept that you could ask students to explain? And if you're doing it, particularly in free writing, they'll often get it wrong, but it will help you figure out, how you could maybe improve your teaching or make it clear. But any examples of difficult concepts? Sure.
The difference between inflectional and derivational morphology.
Would somebody like to volunteer to stand up and explain that? But you can see if you gave that as a small thinking piece or something like that, you could tell which ones were getting it, which ones weren't. It's a really good way to get kind of a quick assessment of what they're learning. And what you'll get back is not what you hope for often.
As an example of that, what is going on with the three-word set of faster, writer, and otter?
No, I could see that if I were in, I have no idea, but if I were in your class, I would enjoy trying to figure that out, writing about it. I mean, it sounds like you're getting at one of the beautiful problems inside your discipline, or the high-level concepts in the discipline. Okay, how about think of a controversial assertion in your field, something that you could use for an in-class debate, for example. Did anybody come up with additional examples of something controversial? Okay.
Are personality traits real?
Would you say that
Are
again?
personality traits real, or can they change?
And what's the first thing that you said?
Personality.
Oh, personality. Okay, this is my hearing aid problem. Okay, and that would be something you could imagine in students debating back and forth and bring in. Okay, that's a perfect example. Is that psychology field, or yeah? Okay, good. Another one. Okay.
How many, or what percentage of State Department appointees should be political appointees, and what percentage should be professionals from any administration?
Okay, great. And that I can see how that would immediately move into debate, because I could assume there'd be a lot of different points of view on that.
And then I assign students to play roles of the historian, because it's history of American foreign relations, roles of the Obama administration, what has he done, and then the right wing and the left wing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, this is.
Get them all ticked off at each other.
Yeah. That's what this is trying to promote, exactly. Getting people ticked off, because there's stakes in these questions. It matters. There's no right. Yeah.
You have to be actually know where the country is.
Right. All right. Excellent. Did any group come up with ideas of giving students a data set and simply having the assignment begin with this close reading of the data set, as opposed to, say, a close reading of a poem or something? So, example? So you're getting volunteered.
In Introduction to Global Development, the students have to work with the online World Bank Atlas and interpret data and maps and compare countries. And that's a writing assignment.
And so you'd give them the data, and then there's some sort of question that can be argued from the data. Okay, excellent. Any other examples of that, of data sets? I know a lot of instructors are trying to teach how to do experimental reports by giving them kind of this hypothetical data. This came up in the results. Do these results support this hypothesis? And then they argue back and forth on whether they do. Okay, how about a challenging reading? A good question related to a reading. Any group come up with that?
I was teaching a class co-teaching class on pastoral care and counseling with the seminarians, and I thought about showing a couple video clips rather than a challenging reading from the old movie Ordinary People.
Yes.
Where Judd Hirsch uses none of the classical techniques of active listening, but is a superb therapist, and just asking students to write what they observed in his interactions and why his insistence that his patient knew the answer to the patient's own question might have a useful payoff for pastors.
Oh, that sounds to me like a great assignment. You can see that all these have the effect of drawing students into the conversations of your discipline, where you really see that you're not just looking for right answer. This matters somehow in the world. This makes a difference in people's lives, how you respond to these questions. Okay. Any other example? Anybody do it with the reading particularly? Okay.
I have students read John Dewey's kind of famously verbose, pragmatist philosopher and educational philosopher, but he wrote an essay called My Pedagogic Creed, which is essentially 5 of his claims about how education ought to proceed, which raises a whole lot of conversation and for repetition at some stage.
And so students could be asked to summarize that, because that's one of the they say moves. Just for somebody who hasn't read it, what does he actually say? Can you summarize it accurately in 100 words or 300 words, whatever? And then speak back to it in some way. Enter into the conversation with that text. And that's a wonderful way to teach the they say, I say move. And so it's possible that in first-year composition here, students could be introduced to this whole notion of summarizing something and then speaking back to it. And then you'd be able to say, remember, you did this in first-year composition. This is the same thing, only it's now a disciplinary question. Okay, these are all good examples. So what I'd like to do at the end, we have now 10 minutes of just, I could respond to any questions you have, or we could talk about exploratory writing, how I go about handling all those thinking pieces that we did from the first aid. I love reading thinking pieces. But any questions you'd like to ask or would like the group to help you answer?
How do we know that the insider expert prose that we're teaching them is not designed for academia, which is what most of them are not going to go into the rest of their lives?
Talk about a question that would get debate. Let's just say I've wrestled with that question a lot, and I can tell you how our department's wrestling with it. So we're having all our students write this capstone paper that's suitable for presentation at undergraduate research conference. So they're all learning to write a paper that's like a mini graduate student paper. Only 2 or 3% of our students ever go to graduate school. So there is one faction in our department that says, well, that's valuable because that's what our discipline does, but we ought to be adding a lot of different kinds of assignments that we currently are not doing. So instead of just doing this capstone paper, we ought to have a portfolio that has other genres that they're writing in. That's one approach, but then other people say, well, I think we ought to just try to convince students. This is the argument that Gerald Graff makes, that we ought to, the former president of MLA, we ought to just show students that this way of thinking transfers to real life. So if you go to law school or something else, you're not going to be doing this particular kind of paper, but the high-level generic skills of posing a problem, entering a conversation, making an argument will transfer to other disciplines. So I don't know where the department's going to go on this. It's pretty contentious right now because, as I say, the University of Washington does not have any equivalent thing in their English department of all students ought to write a capstone paper of this kind. And I'm retired now, so I don't know where the department is eventually going to go. But these are ongoing conversations that at least are informed by the knowledge that we've made a lot of improvement in how students write those capstone papers. So I tried to totally avoid that. that question. Anybody else want to respond to that or have a different insight into it or ask a different question? Okay.
Yeah, this is very programmatic in terms of implementing some of the things that we already are projecting to do by way of changing the freshman curriculum, but then secondly, in terms of what you are calling us to is not be content with that, and I appreciate that emphasis. But incorporating it within the disciplinary tract. I'm sort of partly venting here. We have gone through a lot of such ambitious new curricular changes. And as Seattle U has been doing this, how do you sustain both the energy and enthusiasm of starting a new approach based on the latest research? And how do you acculturate the new people that come in behind who weren't part of that development process and who may not actually be teaching to the standards that the departments or the faculty as a whole has agreed to? And then it peters out. And then we have to have more reform. And maybe that's healthy, but what's the process of sustaining the techniques, the sequencing, the mandatory requirements, the capstone papers that you set up as we look forward 4 to 10 years?
Right. No, that's a great question. I remember once when our kids first got an ant colony, and you order these ant colonies in this little pile, and then the ants come and you put the ants in. And for the first 3 or 4 days, it's really exciting to watch the ants move everything around. And then it gets kind of boring because they've got it all done and there's nothing else to do. This has been the problem that some departments have had, exactly that. It was very exciting to be rethinking what we're going to do in the curriculum. It's very exciting to have some kind of agreement on assignments built for the curriculum. And then teachers start to teach in it and get kind of bored with that assignment, and they begin pushing away. And then you don't know what to do because you don't want to set up a police action, at least I don't think so, with your annual professional review based on whether you did the assignment that we all agreed on. You have the new people coming in, and so I'm just a believer in conversation and process. And so I think there ought to be ways to try to sustain it, but there ought to be ways to let it go and let it evolve in new ways with the hope that it gets better as it goes along. I've stayed on, even though that I'm retired, I've stayed on as assessment coordinator for arts and sciences. And we continue to require assessment. And as you begin to watch departments do different things with assessment, you can really see each time that this is better. I really think when faculty get together and talk about problems, they come up with solutions that do work. So I tend to be, myself, fairly progressive in my belief that process is not just simply cycling back to the old chaos and then a new order and then an old chaos, that it makes progress forward. So I'm optimistic about it, but I sure appreciate the problem. And our department is now right in the phase you have. New people who didn't buy into this to begin with, people who no longer like that assignment as well as we used to. What to do. Then new department chair comes in. So another question I couldn't I couldn't answer.
So I'm curious about calling problems beautiful problems. People might think about engaging or interesting or something that's kind of more intellectual, but you chose the term beautiful. So can you tell us a little bit about why beauty?
When I read that from Ken Bain at the beginning, he just used the word beautiful, and it just struck me as something that was sticky. I liked it because there is a kind of beauty. I mean, we do see our fields in a kind of aesthetic way. There's a kind of elegance in the problems we get. But I don't know if that's actually the best term, beautiful problem. I used to call them, the term I always used to use is ill-structured problem, which comes out of cognitive psychology. And so a good problem is an ill-structured problem. You say, well, if it's a good problem, why is it ill-structured? And that didn't work. So I tried intriguing problem, interesting problem. None of them were sticky. Beautiful problem turned out to be sticky. The way they say, I say, it's sticky. In fact, you even thought about it to remember it. Does it work for you or not?
I can think about a lot of problems that aren't beautiful, so that's the tricky part.
Yeah, okay. But they're real problems, and they're real disciplinary problems. Okay, good point.
What is a not beautiful problem?
Well, I think maybe the problem isn't beautiful, but it might invite discussion of natural or moral beauty as part of a solution, perhaps. But if you think about most of the problems we care about are problems of ugliness and distortion and perversion, or things broken, right? And so then the question is how, maybe think more about worldview that we're approaching.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I mean, I would appreciate a teacher making that clear that often it's not a beautiful problem. Maybe we could find a beautiful solution, but the problem is grating and ugly, wicked. Yeah, okay. Oh, man.
Is the language of problems problematic?
It's very problematic. And I tend to use sometimes a synonymous problem, question, or issue, but they're not the same thing exactly. And the person who's doing the categories of morphology categories of language or whatever, that would be an interesting question to ask, or just what terms to use. But it's I tend to like the notion that a paper sets up a problem at the beginning, but the problem can often be summarized in a question, so you can actually have a grammatical question that summarizes the problem, or it can be set up in a debate where you can have people with opposing views set up the problem. But I tend to call that the problem because it's it always means that it requires an argument with the claim, where question sometimes means right answer. I sometimes in class discussion try to say, I'm now moving from a question that's just recall, like what did Hamlet do in this scene, into a real problem or an authentic problem in which people disagree. Has he changed in the last act or something like that? So students know that I've made this shift from I'm just looking to see if you read it into really thinking about it, and now that's no longer right answer, it's argument. And I tend to use word problem for that kind of question that invites argument. Okay, more questions? Have time for maybe one more? Okay.
On page 2, you said, don't worry for now what you would do with all those thinking pieces. We'll deal with that question later. So as someone who teaches 100 students in a class or 200 students in a class, just any suggestions for implementation with large-scale classes?
Sure. If I had 100 students in a class, I would not use thinking pieces. I might use in-class free writes, but it'd be half the ones I wouldn't have to collect. Like, I don't need to collect all your free writes to give you a grade on it. So I tend to use thinking pieces in classes that are 20, 25, 30. And I simply tell them the thinking piece needs to be a page long. And if it's a page long, I don't need to read it any more than I would need to go listen to you play the piano, practice piano if I were giving you piano lessons. But I like to read them, and so I'm apt to read it. If you really want me to read it, always say, please read, and I'll always read that. So I only have to read if it's less than a page, because less than a page, then I'm going to have to give you a 3, 2, or 1. That's on a 5-point scale. And so they immediately see, well, I got to make it a page long. And then when I do read them, I then score them on this 1 through 5 scale, with 5 being the best. And I tell everybody, if you get a 4, if you get 4s on these thinking pieces, that's an A. And I build in about 10 to 15% incentive, which always raises the grade for the class. So it's a grade inflation issue. But I found that I feel like I can be harder on papers and harder on tests if I do it. So students almost always get an A on the thinking piece part, but all the time they're thinking about problems. The thing that makes it work for me is I always have in class a discussion of whatever the question was the thinking piece was on. So they always know that when they come to class, that's what we're going to be talking about in class that day. So it's a course design problem to get that organized. And then I read them on the ferry on the way home. I can read 20, 25 thinking pieces in 20 minutes, because you're not grading them. You're just reading them real fast. They can be really interesting. You can learn a lot about how students are thinking. And I tell them if I've read it, I will put a mark on it, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If I haven't read it, I'll put a check, and a check counts as a 4, and that counts as an A. And I tell them I don't have to read everything, because the value is it prepares you for the class discussion. The motivation is really being able to participate in the class discussion. And so on a day where I don't have time, I just put checks on all of them. And they understand it. But I always read if they say, please read, because then because sometimes they've really come up with a good idea and they want my reactions. That's how I handle it. But with 100 or 200 students, you might be able to work out course blogs where other people are reading and responding. There are all sorts of different ways to do it, which I talk about in Engaging Ideas. But I've never done that. I've just done the old paper and pencil or typewritten thinking piece. All right, well, I guess that comes right at noon. Did you say you had a few announcements? Thank you all very much.
My assistant has posted the handout on the Center for Scholarship and Faculty Development Teaching and Learning Resources. So if you want a soft copy, you can find it there, and I will send out the link to make it easier. As much as I want to drive traffic to my site, I'll make that easy for you. Thank you again, Dr. Bean, so much. We have 4 quick announcements. The first one, I just want to remind you, as you're looking forward to revisioning your spring syllabi, on April 14th at 7:30 is the Weider Lecture. Jennifer McKinney will be our meritorious scholarship winner this year. The title is Sex and Gender, SECTS, in case I didn't quite say that right. Resistance and reaction to cultural change. I hope it will be here in Upper Gwynn. Not only would you consider attending and listening to our colleague, but would you consider giving credit or extra credit to have your students? It's going to be very interesting this year, and students will very much enjoy it. With that, the handoff is to Michael Paulus.
Thank you. I'm Michael Paulus, the University Librarian. Our anniversary, 125th anniversary for this institution is coming up next year, and one of the things that we would like to do to commemorate this event is identify 125 works that you, the faculty at SPU, think are important. You can think of this as the desert island question. If you were stuck on a desert island, how many, what 12 books or works would you take with you, assuming that you've already got a book, How to Flourish on a Desert Island, or even better, How to Get Off a Desert Island. So Kathleen Braden, Mike McDonald, Carrie Fry, and myself will collect all your desert lists, and we will create a kind of a desert library. And we've got about 30 responses to the survey so far, and this looks like this library could include things from Augustine's Confessions all the way up through the film Babette's Feast. So I'll send out a reminder, so consider what you might want to nominate for this collection. And our goal is to begin sorting through results in April. So thank you. Oh, there'll be a link in the announcement a reminder that I'll send out. Thanks.
Hi, I have a brief announcement about the faculty retreat. This year, Labor Day falls on September 7th, so the retreat will be a week after that on September 14th and 15th. That's a little bit later in the month than it has been in some years, so you may want to plan with that in mind. There may be things that you normally do after the retreat that you consider doing before the retreat, because there's only about a week and a half between the end of the retreat and the beginning of classes. There'll be more information to come about the retreat in the next several months, but for now I just want to give you a heads up about the dates, September 14th and 15th. So you can put those on your calendar, and I look forward to seeing you there.
As many of you know, and I hope everyone knows, Chris Cheney and I are chairing the Academic Innovation Initiative, and we would like to have you save two important dates. One is a Faculty Senate on April 2nd, where we will be able to actually have a faculty-wide discussion about the Academic Innovation Initiative. And April 18th, from 9 through noon, there is going to be Academic Innovation Incubator Weekend. It's a Saturday. It's almost 2 weeks after your Easter and almost a week after my Easter. And so we would really like to invite as many people as can possibly come to engage in brainstorming about ways in which we can balance two things. First of all, faculty at SPU have always tried to preserve perennial values, but we have always also tried to find new ways to engage our students, to improve student learning, and to serve the needs of students that we are currently almost pricing out. And so we would love to have an opportunity to have those kinds of discussions. We thought about giving you the best procrastination target for your grading by uploading now the Academic Innovation Fund request for proposals, but we will wait and do that at the beginning of next quarter and before the April 2nd Senate meeting. So April 2nd and April 18th from 9 to 12. Thank you.
Just to follow up, we would like an RSVP on the April conference, and Stamatis will be sending you out a SurveyMonkey link that you can register for that conference. One final thing, June 8th, Monday, June 8th, we will have our annual faculty awards and a luncheon. So you will get lunch out of this. So, all right, thank you all very much. Bye-bye.